Hello. Today I'd like to share with you a short story entitled That's Her. It's from my first book, The Adventures of George and Mabel. Ready? Let's do it. One night in college during a ball game, George was with his friend Walter. Engrossed in the game, he overheard him talking to someone, maybe a fellow upward bound counselor, about sliding rock. Piqued by the reference, George turned his head away from the ball game and instantly stared into the most alluring blue eyes he'd seen in years. As Walter and this beautiful creature continued chatting, George found himself mesmerized by this strawberry blonde-haired girl and couldn't wait to get back to the dorm and question Walter about her. At the same time, though, he felt he could sit on that hard wooden bleacher forever and just listen to her sweet southern dulcet tones. He wasn't the only one who wanted to talk to Walter. Something about this friend of his, who was trying not to eavesdrop on their conversation, attracted Mabel like none other ever had. She didn't even know his name, but by grabs, she was definitely going to find out. She kept glancing over Walter's shoulder, and he murmured a quick introduction. They smiled at one another and started to say hi, but the game was in its final seconds, and the crowd kept getting in the way. The Lady Lions won, and the crowd went crazy. Celebrations began, and she and her friends were jostled about. Walter and his buddy were nowhere to be seen. From that night on, though, it seemed like they were constantly running into each other. Although they had both been at Mars Hill College for over a year and a half, somehow their eyes had never met. Now, their eyes were constantly seeking the others out. There was George, leaving Miss Verhulst's English class just as Mabel was entering. How had she not ever noticed him before? He certainly was easy on the eyes. Later, in the cafeteria, George saw Mabel at the salad bar and suddenly decided pork chops were not what he really wanted for supper after all. He made his way over, used a funky French voice, and said, "Pardon me, miss, do you have any Grey Poupon?" Mabel laughed and replied, "But of course." They continued making their salads and found themselves heading towards the same table. Walter noticed George and called out, "Hey, Harrison, over here!" Meanwhile, Mabel's friends Tammy and Karen were getting her attention and making room for her at the opposite end. Shrugging a bit sadly, they joined their cronies. Throughout the meal, their eyes continued searching for the others. They shyly smiled at one another, but were not able to talk anymore that night. The next day, as she was coming back from a tutoring session at Mountain Heritage, Mabel saw a slightly familiar soul on the road into town. He was so tall. As her car drew near, she realized it was George. He had been at the local daycare and was walking back toward campus. Rolling down her window as she slowed the car, she called out, "Pardon me, sir. Would you happen to have any Grey Poupon?" Delighted at this unexpected turn of events, not to mention that no one else was around this time to interrupt or distract, George put on a woe-begone face, shook his head, and then brightened when he responded, "No, I haven't any. But I know a place where we can get some. If you'd be so kind as to give me a ride, I'll most gladly fetch you some. My lady," he added, with a twinkle in his blue eyes. And was that a wink? Mabel wondered. Laughing, Mabel told him to get in and that she'd be happy to give him a lift. "I'm quite heavy," George deadpanned. "Are you sure I won't hurt you?" Their eyes met, and without any hesitation at all, Mabel declared, "Positive." It was only a moment, only an nth of a second, but something profound seemed to pass between them. It was as though a seed took root in her heart and burst forth through her soul. A horn honked from behind them, and the spell was broken. George climbed in, buckled up, and There it was again. He did wink while saying something about how one can never be too careful when riding with women drivers. Reaching for the radio dial to drown out his smarmy remark, Mabel sang along to Raise Your Hands to Heaven and Pray, giving George a sideways look while giving old Elmer, her beloved yellow station wagon, some gas before the now irate driver behind them honked again. It was pointless, though. He drove on by, hollering something about it being a road, not a pickup stand. They looked at each other, broke into laughter, and started to drive. Oh, Mabel, speaking, or should I say singing, of heaven, would you be interested in going to the FCA meeting with me on Tuesday? Ha! I was planning on going there too, she responded. I'd be honored to be your guest. Embarrassed at what she had almost blurted out, she reached for the radio dial once more. Steve Winwood was singing Valerie, and Mabel began telling George how she had a sister named Valerie. He told her of his brothers, Mark and Jim. The conversation never lagged. For the next few hours, they talked about any and everything. As they drove around Highway 70 towards Marshall, Mabel asked George, "So, what were you doing at the daycare? Making new friends?" George chuckled and explained, "Do you remember the PDS class we had to take? I was in Dr. Plout's, the sociology teacher, and we had to choose a social project to do. Mine was to go and play with the little kids at the local daycare." Mabel laughed. "Didn't we take that class as freshmen, George? What's the matter? Did you not pass?" She paused. "You didn't fail, did you?" She thought he seemed relatively intelligent, but maybe he wasn't. Humbly, George kind of shook his head and said, No, I passed. I just didn't quit going." Nothing more, just those simple words. Smiling inside, Mabel said to herself, "So, he likes kids. Good to know." As they continued to talk and learn each other, telling what they were there at school for, which dorm they lived in, what they were majoring in, and small details about their families, the trip to find some mustard became a distant memory. They drove all around Madison County, while Mabel explained that she had always loved this area since her high school days of being in Upward Bound. Her dream, she told George longingly, was that one day she would live here. It was about that time that George's stomach began rumbling, loudly, and they realized they had lost track of time. They had missed their chance to eat in the dining hall. Giving George a serious look, telling him she feared he might pass out from starvation, Mabel asked him if he'd like to go grab a hot dog at the Bantam Chef. George replied, once again with that cute wink of his, "Only if they have some Grey Poupon." Tuesday came and Mabel and George were going to the monthly gathering held in the student union for the FCA. They'd only been there a few minutes before George, politely excusing himself, left Mabel at her seat. Not sure what was going on, she turned to her friend Jennifer and asked what tonight's conference was to be about anyway. Jen told her it was about dating and smirked at Mabel and said, "You know, kind of like what you and George are doing." Mabel wasn't sure how to respond to that because, although she would love more than anything else to be seriously dating George, she just wasn't sure that they were there yet. Her thoughts were interrupted when the guest speaker was introduced. Imagine her surprise when the name George Harrison was called out. The audience politely clapped and then listened for the next few moments as George gave his testimony. He had a calm, easygoing manner. He spoke of how all through high school and college he had refrained from most of the dating scene. George revealed that he had encountered many lovely young women and had actually even gone to prom with a couple of them, but not at the same time. There was that wink. The audience was enthralled. He also told of going to a movie or two with others, but he had never let any of it get serious. In fact, none of the dates went beyond friendship. George told the group that somewhere deep inside, a still small voice was whispering, "Be protective of this one's feelings, for she is not yours." He continued, "Don't lead her on. Don't give her false expectations or illusions." So he obeyed, and he was. Protective, I mean. George began to tell the group how he knew, hoped, that God would lead him to the one that was to be his one day, and that was when he suddenly became speechless. He had just locked eyes with the enchanting, blue-eyed, red-headed beauty he had seen at the gymnasium just weeks ago. What a time for the Lord to whisper, "That's her." As Mabel's eyes locked onto George's, electricity passed between them. Jennifer even shivered. It was profound. While hardly anyone else in the crowd seemed to notice, George and Mabel knew. They knew they had found the one their souls had been searching for. As George concluded his testimony, he realized that he was the one who had been on trial. He recognized that he was the one being issued an indictment, a life sentence, one without parole, and one from which there would be no turning back. As he made his way back to Mabel, his heart was rejoicing. Somehow, he smiled to himself, this was a consequence he was happy to face. With a wink, he reached for her hand. With shimmering eyes, Mabel grasped his fingers in hers, feeling forever, feeling safe, feeling home. I hope you enjoyed the story. Again, it's from my first book, The Adventures of George and Mabel, based on an almost, kind of, sort of, could be true story. It's available on Amazon.com. Thanks for watching.